Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. Now, with no further ado, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey. Good evening from Israel. It's been quite a week since we last met. Obviously, the main event since last Wednesday was the terrorist attack in Tel Aviv on a busy street, one of the busiest streets in Tel Aviv, especially on a Thursday night, which is probably the main night that people go out. Where the bars and the restaurants and the cafes and the clubs are full, and basically a Palestinian terrorist who infiltrated from the Jenin area walked down a main street and basically opened fire, I believe inside a restaurant, killed two people, eventually a third was added. I believe there's still some others who are in critical condition. But the most remarkable thing about that night was what happened after. Usually in these things, there's usually a very quick end to the event. The terrorist will be shot by police. He'll carry on shooting until he's stopped by someone, sometimes a passerby who may be armed or something like that. But what happened was that he appeared to leave the area. At the time, the police, the army, the security forces were not aware, and they shut down a main part of Tel Aviv. Again, I stress on probably the busiest night of the week. People were told to remain in their homes for blocks and blocks. Probably thousands of people, maybe even more, were told to remain in their homes, shut their windows, do not stand on their balconies, do not watch what's going on, because they were afraid. At the beginning, there were two or three terrorists. In the end, they understood that there was only one, but they had no idea where he was. They really tried as much as possible to get intelligence, to get a picture of the person for hours. Everyone was sort of in suspense around the country. Israelis were watching to see. But what was remarkable is the amount of security forces. There was over 1,000 of them in the heart of Tel Aviv, just going house to house, going down streets. And what was even more remarkable, and certainly made a lot of the news in the coming days, was the fact that the Israeli media followed every single step the security forces took. You just saw tens or hundreds of security forces going house to house, going up and down the street. Sometimes you would see them getting information, they'd go running to a particular building, and the reporters were right in the heart of it. It's got a lot of criticism the next day, and we saw an unprecedented press release. I think it was from the army, the police, and the border patrol all in one, saying that the media acted irresponsibly. It gave away too much information in the field, too much intelligence on what was happening, and just also made them look a little bit weak, a little bit sort of not knowing what was going on, and maybe even gave a little bit of strength to the enemy. In the end, in the early hours, they found the terrorist who was hiding out in a mosque or near a mosque in Jaffa, not too far away, but still a relative amount of time he must have taken to get there. It's clear from these type of situations that he was probably given away by someone local who just didn't want that sort of trouble on their doorstep. And there was a gunfight with two or three security officials, and the terrorist was shot dead. What then we saw again after all the recent terror attacks, the number of Israelis or people in Israel, because some of them were not Israeli citizens, who have been killed in recent attacks has now sadly risen to 14. After each one, we've seen mass celebrations on the Palestinian streets, whether in Gaza or Judea and Samaria. And this one was no different. The father of the terrorist basically said, after hearing about the attack, that his son was a hero, that this brings us closer to ultimate victory. But what was interesting is that the father was a retired senior PA official. And it really spoke to where we are today, because officially the PA, or at least its leader Mahmoud Abbas, put out a statement, not the strongest statement, but certainly stronger than previous ones, condemning the attack, but then of course giving that caveat, condemning all attacks against Israelis and Palestinians alike, as if there was some equivalence here. But we have seen that there's been a very strong move by many, not just in Hamas, not just in Islamic Jihad, which is obvious, but even amongst groups associated with the PA, with Fatah, and other Palestinian Authority associated groups who have really supported some of these actions. There's a few other senior PA officials who have come out and tried to do terror attacks. So it shows that the weakening of the PA and the certain divisions in the hierarchy of the Palestinian Authority towards this upsurge in terror attacks against Israel. What we do know is that there's been an average of at least 2 attacks, attempted attacks, every day over the last 10 days. The Israeli forces have said that they thwarted at least 20 attacks, and that number is certainly certain to rise. Even today, the IDF has been really in the heart of some of these villages and towns and refugee camps, trying to act on any intelligence that it has, and it seems to have quite good intelligence, to thwart any potential attacks. There's been reports of the thwarting of major terrorist attacks which were planned to take place over the upcoming Passover holiday, which begins on Friday. Also, we have the Easter holiday on Friday, and as we know, we're in the middle of Ramadan, so we've got a heightened period of tension that around holidays celebrated by Jews, Muslims, and Christians. It is clear that we are in a wave of terror attacks. What is clear is Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has said that we are going on the offensive. We are not just waiting for them in our towns. We're going to be in their places, wherever they are, we are going to be there. And to a certain extent, it seems like they're acting on that, because the idea for the first time in many, many years has really taken the fight to, as I said, to the Palestinian towns and villages. Really, any sort of idea of any attacks planned, anyone involved in any terror attacks have been yanked out of their houses, off the streets, or sometimes arrests were tried to be made, and then there was a shootout, and some of the terrorists were then what they call here neutralized, which usually means killed. But it is clear that the IDF understands, and the Israeli security establishment understand, that they have to take different action. Another thing that they've realized is that the security fence has too many holes. At least 2 of the recent terrorists have utilized the gaps, which usually are sort of used by day laborers. A lot of Palestinian day laborers, tens of thousands, come in from Judea and Samaria into Israel to work. And there's a sort of understanding that that's allowed because Israel needs the day laborers, and they want Palestinian economy to function. And these people bring back a lot more money than they can make within the PA. So there's sort of been a blind eye turned to this. But as the terror attacks have increased and the attempted terror attacks have increased, these holes have been shored up. The government gave tens of millions of shekels to shore up these holes and to increase the IDF presence along the security barrier, while also Defense Minister Benny Gantz has also tried to alleviate the pressure by instructing the inclusion of tens of thousands of Palestinians to legally enter Israel. That means that they'll come through checkpoints where they'll have to supply their ID cards. So the idea is that that will be a more official, legal, and safe way for Palestinians to enter Israel that will negate some of the terrorist actions. We'll have to wait and see what exactly happens with that. What we have seen from the leader of the Joint List, the Arab Joint List in Israel, Ayman Odeh, is that thanks to some of the response that the IDF has taken in recent days, he, very controversial as you can imagine, came out and said that all Arabs serving in Israel's security forces, whether the IDF or police or border patrol, should put down their weapons or throw them back at the Zionists, or whatever language he used, which, as one can imagine, received quite a a response from across Israeli society, obviously from the right and the center and the left and even the far left, and even Mansour Abbas, the leader of their rivals in the Arab community, Ram, which also came out and said, Ayman Odeh and his party doesn't offer any solutions, just rhetoric and hate, etc. What we have seen, especially today, is what some have said is the mirror image of that hate and rhetoric and extremism. This is how it's been characterized by none other than Chili Tropper, who is the Minister of Culture and Sport of Benny Gantz's Blue and White Party, who said that Ayman Odeh and Bezalel Smotrich of the National Religious Party, the far-right the religious Zionist Party, came out today with some extraordinary comments, which he subsequently walked back. But what he did say is that that anyone who involves themselves in this government, who claims to be from the right in the religious community, should not be allowed into public institutions, and including synagogues, B'tei Knesset. And that got him into quite a lot of bother, as you can imagine. Prime Minister Bennett made them the center of his remarks at a ceremony today, saying that this is what caused the destruction of the Jewish temple and the Jewish Commonwealth and the Jewish state 2,000 years ago, this sort of hatred, and that we should be able to get through disagreements. And he gave an impassioned response and defense of his government that says, since I've been working with some of these people who are considered on the left, I understood that they may have differences of opinion, and we have very different, major differences of opinion, but their love of the land, of the state of Israel, of the Jewish state, is no less great than mine. And that's what we should be doing. We should be working together, especially during these challenging times. As I said, Bezalel Smotrich tried to walk back some of the comments, not completely, by sort of claiming, well, Bennett lied and he deceived his supporters and he's working with these left-wing Islamist parties, so he has no rights, etc., etc. But as we can imagine, those comments caused a lot of controversy. Moving finally on, before we take questions, onto what's happening in the internal political map. As we know, recently Idit Silman from the Yamina party, Prime Minister Bennett's party, moved across, which basically gave the opposition and the coalition an even 60 each, which means that if one more member would move across to the opposition, they could pass a vote of not a vote of no confidence, a vote of dispersal of the Knesset. Well, that hasn't happened. The momentum has been taken out. It is clear that around the same time as they were talking to Idit Silman, they were also talking to Eila Shaked, who is the closest person in Yamina, the interior minister, closest person to Prime Minister Bennett. They've been partners all the way through their political careers. It's clear that there were discussions were taking place, significant discussions, but in the end, she decided not to bolt. Idit Silman was promised that when she did bolt the coalition, that it would only be a few hours before someone else did. That clearly did not happen, and it now comes out that there's been a lot of other promises, including to her husband, if she would leave the coalition, which she did. Another possible contender to leave the coalition, Nir Orbach, was certainly under a lot of pressure, and he put up at least 3 demands of Prime Minister Bennett to remain in the government, to cancel the end of payments to yeshiva students for extra activities in the afternoon, was one of those demands, which Finance Minister Victor Lieberman, who was the proponent of these, agreed to put off another year. Another one was to ensure that what they call the new settlements, basically the settlements that were built without permission from Israel, which are, quote unquote, illegal under Israeli law, but to ensure that they have electricity. That was one of the demands in the coalition agreements from Yamina. It wasn't being pushed through, but now we understand that Interior Minister Gideon Saar has given, not Interior Minister, Justice Minister Gideon Saar has given his approval. So it's now just for Benny Gantz, the Defense Minister, to give his approval, and that will happen. The third condition was to ensure that there'd be a committee that would be created, or at least re-established, to ensure that building Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria would continue apace. So at the moment, the three potential defectors from Yamina, whether they're Ayelet Shaked, Nir Orbach, or Kara, are not leaving. We're still in a sort of a recess of Knesset, so there's not much going on, although there was a meeting today where there was actually coalition and opposition coming together on tax breaks and lowering the cost of gas and petrol. So it shows that they can work together when it's for certain issues, which they both understand is important to their political base. But the fireworks haven't started. They will start in May when the Knesset reconvenes. Nothing is probably going to happen until that point, because we won't see probably those defections. Those three members of Knesset, or in at least one case a minister, they are keeping tabs on the situation. They are going to see what happens if they have got what to contribute to this government. If not, then we could certainly see it fall. But as I said last week, this government does have a sell-by date, and that is March next year, because if the budget is not past 3 months into the year, then the government automatically falls. And at this point in time, without some major surprise of either Idit Zilman returning to the government, which I don't see. This week she confirmed that she has no intention to do so, even though the government has been very careful, and it has been a talking point, to make sure that they don't alienate her. Even if she doesn't return to the government, maybe they can get her to vote with the government, the coalition, on certain issues. They hope that of Amichai Shikli, who was the first renegade Yamina MK, but that never happened, and they finally have placed the official status of renegade MK on him, which means if it goes through, he will not be able to run in the next elections with an existing party. So that obviously hampers his opportunities in the next parliament, and also sends a message to other Yamina MKs that regardless of what Likud or other parties promise you, you may well not have a future just because of this particular legal definition. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions on any of the issues or anything else on your mind.
All right, thank you so much. So the first question in is from Len Levin. Daniel Pipes and many others believe that the best or perhaps only way to reduce the Arab terrorism is to seek a complete victory, meaning that Israel has to break the will of the other side. Do you think that Israel will ever go this route?
Well, there's ups and downs. A lot of the time, Israel sort of takes defensive operations, or what it calls mowing the lawn, which are usually those operations in Hamas where it tries to degrade the capability of Hamas and other terrorist groups to operate for a certain amount of time, or put them ensure that they're in a worse situation. So they understand it's not in their interest to carry on with that particular conflict. But seeking a total victory has not been seen probably since 1967 with the Six-Day War. Breaking the will of the opponent is a tactic which has been used throughout history to end conflicts, but disregarding certain events here and there, and certain operations and certain actions, Israel has not gone down that route. It may be forced to. At the moment, Israelis are feeling a lot of pain from the 40 people who were killed over the last couple of weeks. But fortunately or unfortunately, whatever way you want to look at it, it's not got to the point where Israel there's not a public outcry for another Operation Defensive Shield, which we saw, if one remembers, I think it was even 20 years, it was around 20 years ago, the second Intifada, and the sort of the straw that broke the camel's back was the mass murder at a Passover Seder in a hotel in Netanyahus. That was really the action, the terrorist event that forced or pushed the then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon into Operation Defensive Shield. And that was probably the last large-scale operation that Israel did in Judea and Samaria to really try and break the back of the terrorist infrastructure there. And we're now coming up to 20 years from that, and it's clear that the terrorist infrastructure is very much back in place. So there's been a lot of talk around that date coming up to Passover Seder and some of the attempted attacks. There's been a lot of talks about that. do we need another Operation Defensive Shield? Are we in the same situation as we were before? Some say we're in a better situation, certainly with intelligence, that we maybe don't need it, and this was before the defensive fence that Israel since erected. So there's starting to be a debate about that. Whether there will be another defensive shield, I guess, depends on what happens in the next few weeks, whether there continues to be bloodshed on Israeli streets. If there is, which obviously we all hope there won't be, then there'll be far greater outcry for a major operation. But at the moment, we're finding a certain level of success with these more pinpoint measures taken against sort of what they call ticking bombs, those that they believe are planning an attack or on their way to an attack, which we've seen the IDF and other security forces thwart over the last 10 days.
Thank you so much. Barak Korkmaz asks, who is the rational actor in the Palestinian Arab sector? With whom can Israel communicate?
Well, there are behind the scenes. It depends what you mean. If we talk about security issues, there are senior people in the PA who understand that they're not doing Israel a service when they help them, with Hamas or Islamic Jihad activists, because they're a threat to the PA just as much as they are to Israel. So there's a confluence of interest there rather than any particular interest to help Israel. Certainly the PA, at least at the highest levels, is for them it's very important to have stability, to retain whatever small amount of control that they have today, to make sure that Hamas does not have a foothold, as it does obviously in Gaza and Islamic Jihad and even ISIS and some of these other groups. As I said at the beginning, as we've seen, the PA is very fractured. There is little agreement on what its response should be. I don't think you'll find much sympathy for Israel anywhere in the PA, but again, it's about what their interests are. So that at the highest levels, highest security levels, there is good security coordination, especially over the last few days. And I would be surprised if a lot of that went some way to what we're witnessing on Palestinian streets, with the idea of arresting and foiling some of these attacks, because again, it's in their interest, not because they necessarily want to save Israeli lives. But on the diplomatic front, nothing is moving. There's no interest. Palestinian leadership has expressed no interest, is not willing or able to come to the negotiating table, even if there was an Israeli government who could move on the diplomatic process, which clearly this particular one is not able to.
Thank you so much. And Eric and Alvin Corres ask about Joseph's tomb. Eric asked, can you please talk about what is happening at Joseph's tomb? Why is there little press about it as opposed to the Temple Mount, where the action is on the news, and what is Israel doing about it?
Right. So those two events are very interesting. I'd like to go into them a little bit deeper. First of all, Joseph's tomb is a tomb that's considered the final resting place of the biblical Joseph, which is in Area A, which is under full Palestinian control in the Shechem or Nablus. It's on the outskirts of the city. It was a flashpoint during the Second Intifada, as we know. It used to be guarded by Israeli. There was an understanding that Israeli soldiers would guard it, but it was attacked, and even Israeli, I believe he was a Druze officer, who was left to die as it burnt, and they couldn't get him out, and it was a terrible scene. So since then, they've kind of left it under PA control. Again, the PA has had an interest in not seeing too much problems surrounding that. Every now and again, under IDF cover, some pilgrims go in the middle of the night, they pray, and they get out within an hour, usually with no particular problems. But it has become a flashpoint. And again, a few days ago, Palestinians did attack it, did firebomb it. But then some Israelis came in and repaired it again in IDF cover. There were reports earlier of Palestinians again trying to converge on it to try and burn it down. There is very rarely any outcry in the international arena. There's very little, if ever, coverage on this issue in the international press, as opposed to what's happening in the Temple Mount. Just today, what was fascinating is a tiny, never heard before group of a Jewish group that basically offered money to anyone who could take a lamb up to the Temple Mount to slaughter it, in sort of in mind of the ancient sacrifices that used to take place on the Temple Mount. I mean, again, probably the organization has a handful of people, and it wasn't, no one took it up on it, but it became, it's not supported by the Israeli government, any mainstream Jewish organizations, but it became internationally condemned. Jordan putting out official press releases, Hamas threatening, Islamic Jihad threatening, Hezbollah threatening, all these organizations saying that this is a red line and this is going to bring about a new Middle East war and all this sort of thing. So it shows, and you can imagine this was covered everywhere in those, as I said, international condemnation, just because a bunch of people, probably no more than 4 or 5, who just decided to put out a press release that they would offer a couple of $100 for anyone who managed to smuggle a lamb up on the Temple Mount. By the way, they didn't even have to slaughter it. They just had to smuggle it up and they would be offered a few $100. Obviously, the Israeli officials, to make sure this doesn't happen, it's probably not even going to happen. But the fact that there is such a disparate, inordinate amount of attention on those two events just shows the difference in the way that Jewish holy sites are seen as opposed to what are perceived as Muslim holy sites in the international arena.
Thank you so much. Mehrdad Hansari asks, how is the lack of expected progress in the JCPOA talks being perceived by Israeli officials?
Well, Israel is trying to take a back seat. It's clear that they don't want to be seen as the one who are seen as stopping these negotiations or stopping the agreement. That's always been the tightrope that Israel has played. They've been against it. They've voiced and expressed repeatedly their opposition to return to this, what they see as a deeply flawed agreement. But there appears to be a major stumbling block. The Iranians are, as they have done, overplaying their hands, trying to take a more extreme position. What interestingly happened was, I think we talked about a couple of weeks ago, there was talk of the Biden administration removing the Revolutionary Guards from the list of terrorist entities. But there was a major backlash, not just from Israel, but from Sunni countries and many moderate and pragmatic players in the region. And it led to the chief of staff of the US Army coming out and saying he was against it. And it now seems that the Biden administration is certainly climbing down off that one, officially claiming that they were never considering it, but it's clear that there was significant consideration that move to try and bring the Iranians back to the table. But ever since that happened, it's obviously not just that particular event, but the Iranians seem to be moving further and further away from the table. And their stance is sort of, well, we're staying in Iran until the agreement that we want is on the table, which at the moment doesn't seem to be forthcoming from the P5+1.
Thank you. Barak Kirkmaz asks, what do you think about Khamenei's latest tweets on Saudi, Yemen, Israel, Palestinians, and U.S. and the JCPOA? Is he trying to spread the bushfire and keep Iran under the radar?
I have to say, I didn't see these particular tweets. I can't really comment on them.
Yeah, no problem. So an anonymous attendee asks, is there any action regarding the illegal settlements in the Negev and the Arab towns?
Is there any action on them? I mean, again, I don't know exactly what the person is referring to. There are settlements, towns, encampments, whatever you want to call it. That's been going for many, many, many years. There are sometimes actions taken against them. Frequently, there are little to nothing being done against them. And certainly, again, we've got to remember that this particular coalition has Ram in it, which is the Islamist party, and the backbone of their support are the Bedouins in the Negev. So steps, whereas to sort of lower the violence, the intra-Arab violence, or even the Arab violence not necessarily connected to terrorism down there, is something that they can back to remove any of these unauthorized villages or encampments or settlements, whatever you want to call them, is going to be very tough under this particular political constellation.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you again for taking time to update us this week.
Thank you.
And of course, for our viewers and listeners, we will not be having a webinar on Friday. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.